Welcome back to continue with our discussion on post theory. We have been talking about an array of theories available to us and how scholars in recent times are responding to it, particularly in the face of bewilderment which is faced by students as well as general educated readers when they come across these array of isms and theories and approaches, and what is happening to literature and how do we situate literature in these times. That is the question. Therefore, we live in post theoretical times. Now, in favor of theory, we have been talking about theory and its against people who have taken a stand against it, but then there are scholars like David Lodge, theorist and novelist, and Nigel Wood. In this book in a reader called Modern Criticisms and Theory, a reader, Lodge and Wood argue that it is not surprising that contemporary literary theory came into being from outside philosophy and sometimes in conscious rebellion against the weight of its tradition. Literary theory may now well have become a legitimate concern of philosophy, but it cannot be assimilated to it either factually or theoretically. It contains a necessarily pragmatic moment that certainly weakens it as theory, but that adds a subversive element of unpredictability and makes it sometimes or something of a wild card in the serious game of the theoretical discipline. Those who reproach literary theory for being oblivious to social and historical or even ideological reality are merely stating that their fear at having their own ideological mystifications exposed by the tool that they are trying to discredit, that is theory. What is it about literary theory that is so threatening that it provokes such a strong resistance and attacks? That can be a question. It upsets rooted ideologies by revealing the mechanics of their workings. It goes against a powerful philosophical tradition of which aesthetics is a prominent part. It upsets the established canon of literary works and blurs the borderlines between literary and non-literary discourse. For it makes the tension between contemporary literary theory and the tradition of literary studies appear as a mere historical conflict. Many a time the development of literary theory is itself overdetermined by complications inherent in its very project and unsettling with regard to its status as a scientific discipline. Resistance may be built in constituent of its discourse in a manner that would be inconceivable in the natural science and unmentionable in the social sciences. It may well be, in other words, that the polemical opposition, the systematic non-understanding and misinterpretation, the unsubstantial but eternally recurrent objection are the displays symptom of a resistance inherent in the theoretical enterprise itself. The real debate of literary theory is not with its polemical opponents, but rather with its own methodological assumptions and possibilities. Rather than asking why literary theory is threatening, we should perhaps ask why it has such difficulty going about its business and why it lapses so readily either into the language of self-justification and self-defense, or else into the overcompensation of a programmed utopian, a euphoric utopian. Such insecurity about its own project calls for self-analysis if one is to understand the frustrations that attend upon its practitioners, even when they seem to dwell in methodological self-assurance. And if these difficulties are indeed an integral part of the problem, then they will have to be, or to some extent, ahistorical in the temporal sense of the term. The resistance to theory is a resistance to the use of language about language. It is therefore a resistance to language itself, or to the possibility that language contains factors or functions that cannot be reduced to intuition. They are theory and not theory at the same time. The universal theory of the impossibility of theory, to the extent they are theory, that is to say, teachable, generalizable, and highly responsive to systematization. Rhetorical readings, like the other kinds, still avoid and resist the readings they advocate. Nothing can overcome the resistance to theory, since theory is itself this resistance. The loftier the aims and the better the methods of literary theory, the less possible it becomes. Yet literary theory is not in danger of going under. It cannot help but flourish, and the more it is resisted, the more it flourishes, since the language it speaks is the language of self-resistance. What remains impossible to decide is whether this flourishing is a triumph or a fall. This understanding of theory is rightly explained by Judith Butler. Theory, as Butler states, has been mistaken by many people to be a position of permanent skepticism. Instead, she sees it as nothing more than a critical interrogation of beliefs we already carry with us. It is a form of inquiry that does not deny the existence of the world, but rather relates to it crucially. Theory is never fully abstract, she says, for it is in the context of action that we have to think. In her words, theory is an engaged form of reflection that frequently emerges in tandem with suffering. Now, Stephen Knapp and Walter Ben Michaels have discussed the position of theory in Against Theory. Now, they state that theory is an attempt to govern the interpretations of particular texts by appealing to an account of interpretation in general. Either theorists ground the reading of literary text to guarantee objectivity and validity of interpretation, or translate the instability to produce agreements among interpreters as an alternate mode of theory. Theory attempts to solve a set of familiar problems. The mistake is that they imagine the problems to be real. Their mistake is that they imagine the possibility of moving from one term, author's intended meaning, to a second term, the text meaning, when the two terms are the same, and that is what Knapp and Michaels believe in. Meaning of a text can be nothing other than the author's meaning and is determined by the character of the speaker's intention. That all literary interpretation must stress a reconstruction of the author's aims and attitudes in order to evolve guides and norms for constructing the meaning of his text. Theorists argue against formalist arguments, deny importance of authorial intention. You might recall that we have been talking about Wimsatt and Beardsley's affective and intentional fallacies and intentions of authors. So, they conceive a text as a piece of language, a public object defined by public norms. Their idea is that only by assigning a particular intention to words can one arrive at a determinate interpretation. There is no such thing as intentionless language. There is no getting away from intentionality for Knapp and Michaels. Missing this point, and hence imagining the possibility of two different kinds of meaning, is more than a theoretical mistake. It is the sort of mistake that makes theory possible. It makes theory possible because it creates the illusion of a choice between alternative methods of interpreting. To be a theorist is to think that there is a choice. Theory loses the moment it realizes that there are no theoretical choices to be made. Theorists believe that intention is something that is added to a language prior to or independent of it. Thus, textual meaning equates authorial intention. A statement about meaning of work equates a statement about author's intention. Knapp's and Michael's thesis is that it is a mere platitude that the meaning of a text is what the author intended, so that theoretical discussions of this relationship, denials and elaborate defenses are equally redundant. Any objection depends on mistaking the meaning of the argument, since the authors intended to be irrefutable. As they point out, the absence of intention seemed to make the marks meaningless. Now, there have been criticism for Knapp's and Michael's. The Knapp-Michael's doctrine is latently paradoxical. Intention is not sufficient to generate the meaning of a sculpture or sonnet or a song. That is what the critics feel. Art is not magic. One can fail, and failure is precisely a discrepancy between the actual meaning of your creation and what you wanted it to be. Art can mean something unintended. Another great work is by Terry Eagleton, After Theory, where Eagleton feels that we are living now in the aftermath of what one might call high theory, in an age which, having grown rich on the insights of thinkers like Althusser, Barthes and Derrida, has also in some ways moved beyond them. The generations that followed developed the original ideas, added to them, criticized them and applied them. For Eagleton, the ambitiousness and originality of high theories such as Derridian post-structuralism has given way to the laziness and derivativeness of the current practices of cultural theory, such as some of the current instantations of identity theory and post-colonial theory. Whereas high theory was formed out of a real sensitivity to the social and political realities of the 1960s, current cultural theory appears to Eagleton to be born out of attempts merely to be fashionably obscure, and this is one of the key criticisms against theory. It deliberately remains obscure and inaccessible even to the general educated readers. Whereas the golden age of cultural theory was invested in critical agency, that is, producing theoretical interventions that would result in praxis and have an actual effect on consciousness. The current state of cultural theory is regarded by Eagleton as primarily reverential and uncritical. Even so-called cutting edge and innovative contemporary cultural theory such as identity theory and post-colonial theory is on the whole politically empty, according to Eagleton. Most post-colonialists today, for example, would vigorously charge, contrary to Eagleton, that they are politically engaged theorists. However, for Eagleton, the case of post-colonial criticism is symptomatic of much of what was lost in the transition from a golden age of cultural theory, that is work done by people like Raymond Williams or Bourdieu and Julia Kristeva, Derrida, etc., to the present, the loss of a connection with the politics of our daily lives and lived experience in the world. In the case of post-colonial criticism, this came about through the displacement of class conflict in cultural theory. Writes Eagleton, much post-colonial theory shifted the focus from class and nation to ethnicity, and that is a drawback. This means, or this meant, among other things, that the distinctive problems of post-colonial culture were often falsely assimilated to the very different question of Western identity politics. Since ethnicity is largely a cultural affair, this shift of focus was also one from politics to culture. Eagleton argues that the shift to discourses of colonialism and post-colonialism in contemporary cultural theory only deflects from the real issue, that is class conflict. For Eagleton, the progressiveness and political engagement of current waves of theory such as post-colonialism and identity theory are dubious because they take cultural theory further from its existential, social and most significantly political context. Similarly, problems occur with other major contemporary cultural theories such as feminism and postmodernism. In the first half of After Theory, Eagleton is doing nothing less than placing theories such as post-colonialism, feminism and postmodernism in what James Sonosky had called the theory junkyard, because these theories have drifted too far from an engagement with the actual world with lived experience and everyday life. In other words, for Eagleton, what may be termed second and third generation theories such as post-colonialism, feminism and postmodernism theories that followed from high theories are found to be lacking because they have lost their grounding in social and political realities. As one might expect, now Eagleton, whose works over the years have been strongly influenced by the works of Marx and Marxism. So, we have to expect this from Eagleton. He is very defensive about the place of Marxism in the landscape of cultural theory. He manages to connect Marx and Marxism to the successes of high theory, while at the same time distancing them from the failures of current instantations of high theory. For Eagleton, it is clearly false to say, as some have, that Marxism has had nothing to say about race, nation, colonialism or ethnicity, and he takes many opportunities to connect Marxism with high theory. Eagleton notes, for example, that Derrida also claims nowadays that he has always understood his own theory of deconstruction as a kind of radical Marxism, and that it seems fair to say that much of the new cultural theory was born out of creative dialogue with Marxism. However, Eagleton distances Marxism from failures of high theory. This is especially true in the case of postmodern theories of Lyotard and Baudrillard. Of Lyotard, he says, when Lyotard rejected what he called grand narrative, he first used the term to mean simply Marxism. We have already seen Lyotard's rejection of Christian redemption and Marxism as grand narratives. Of Baudrillard, Eagleton says that it was Baudrillard who doubted that the Gulf War even took place. On the whole, though Marxism and Marxist thought are selectively affiliated with high theory, they managed to avoid the thorough slashing he gives current cultural theory. Eagleton believes that although there is a future for cultural theory after high theory, it is not to be found in anti-theory. For him, anti-theory is embodied in the works of Stanley Fish and Rorty, thinkers who epitomize what is lost by contemporary instantations of high theory. According to Eagleton, their anti-theory means more than wanting nothing to do with theory. For Fish and Rorty, theory is how you try to justify your way of life. For them, this is rather neither possible nor necessary. For Eagleton, you cannot justify your way of life by theory, because theory is part of that way of life, not something set apart from it. Eagleton contends that the so-called anti-foundationalism of Fish and Rorty appear to have simply replaced one kind of anchor with another. It is now culture, not God or nature, writes Eagleton, which is the foundation of the world. Eagleton is clearly not impressed by the anti-foundationalist anti-theories of Fish and Rorty. According to Eagleton again, cultural theory has made only two major achievements or gains it has disabused us of the idea that there is a single correct way to interpret a work of art, and it has persuaded us that there are many things involved in the making of a work of art besides the author. Moreover, cultural theory seems to have lost more than it has gained. What it has lost are absolute truth, objectivity, foundation, morality and depth. So, now we have been talking about post theory, and we have been talking about the key theories related to the notion. Terry Eagleton, of course, after theory. You also have a book called Post Theory, New Direction in Criticism, which is an edited volume by Martin McQuillan et al. Okay, so there are major works being done in understanding what is theory in today's time. So, this brings us to the end of this course, Literary Theory and Criticism. I hope by now you have been submitting your assignments regularly. We are aware that you have been submitting your assignments. We have been responding to your queries also very regularly and promptly. So, I do hope that you enjoyed the course, and very soon you are going to have your end semester or the certification exam. So, do it well, and thank you very much for being with us.